Retired CIA analyst Marcus Webb had spent 31 years finding things that didn't want to be found. He had located black sites, tracked financial networks across 17 jurisdictions, and once identified the location of a weapons cache from a single frame of satellite imagery showing the shadow of a fence posed at the wrong angle. He was the best analyst his division had ever produced, and he knew it without being insufferable about it. So when he drove into the fishing village of Ronbeeg on the northwest coast of Scotland in October 2023, following a signal he had been tracking for 6 months that led, improbably, to 43 people living at the edge of the Atlantic, and realized that the village had known he was coming, had prepared for his arrival, and had been waiting for someone exactly like him for a very specific reason. He understood, for the first time in 31 years, what it felt like to be the thing that was found. Marcus Webb was 58 years old, a retired senior analyst from the CIA's Directorate of Analysis, who had left the agency in 2021 after 31 years of service, and had spent the subsequent 2 years doing the things that people who have spent 31 years in intelligence do when they stop: traveling slowly, sleeping adequately, and finding that the analytical mind does not stop analyzing simply because its institutional context has been removed. He lived in a rented flat in Edinburgh, which he had chosen because it was interesting and far enough from Washington to feel like a different life. He consulted occasionally, nothing operational, nothing that required a clearance he no longer held, and spent most of his time reading, walking, and following threads. The thread that led to Ronbeeg had begun in April 2023 with a pattern anomaly in publicly available maritime traffic data. This was not unusual behavior for Marcus. He analyzed things the way some people drank coffee, not because he decided to, but because the alternative was not something his brain knew how to do. He had subscriptions to 3 satellite imagery services, access to several open-source intelligence aggregators, and the habit of running low-level pattern analysis on publicly available datasets in the way that other retired people did crosswords. The maritime anomaly was small, a cluster of fishing vessel transponder signals in a section of the northwest Scottish coast that showed a consistent behavioral pattern. The vessels went out. The vessels came back, normal fishing activity. But the timing was wrong, the returns were too consistent, too precisely spaced, in a way that fishing operations, which were governed by weather and catch and the 100 variables of working the sea, did not usually produce. And the positions, when he plotted them against the bathymetric data for that section of coast, showed the vessels returning from a specific deepwater location that was not, according to any fishing industry database he could access, a productive fishing ground. They were not fishing. He spent 6 months working the thread. He identified the village, Ronbeeg, population 43, a settlement so small it appeared on only the most detailed Ordnance Survey maps, accessible by a single track rode off the A894 in Sutherland, at the end of a sea lock that cut into the highland interior like a blade. He could find almost nothing about it: no local news coverage, no social media presence, no planning applications, no records beyond the basic administrative documentation that any settlement in Scotland accumulated. For a settlement of 43 people in the 21st century, it was extraordinarily quiet. Extraordinarily quiet was something Marcus Webb knew how to recognize. He drove to Ronbeeg on October 11, 2023. The single-track road to Ronbeeg ran for 11 kilometers from the main road through highland landscape of exceptional bleakness and beauty, bog heather, the occasional stand of wind-shaped birch, the loch appearing and disappearing through the hills. No other vehicles, no other habitation. The road ended at the village. Ronbeeg was small in the way that settlements at the edge of things are small: a cluster of stone houses around a harbor, a small pier, 3 fishing boats, a building that had been a church and might still be, a community hall, everything grey stone and practical and oriented toward the water. And a woman standing at the end of the pier, looking at the road, as if she had known a car was coming. He parked, he got out, he walked to the pier. She was perhaps 60, compact, weathered, with the eyes of someone accustomed to reading weather and water from long distance. She said, "Mr. Webb, we've been expecting you." He said, "You know my name." She said, "We know quite a lot about you. Come in, there's tea." Her name was Morag. She was, as far as Marcus could determine over the next several hours, the person the village communicated through, not a leader exactly, but an interface. The person who talked to the outside when the outside needed talking to. She took him to the community hall. 6 other village residents were there, men and women ranging from perhaps 30 to perhaps 75, all with the same quality of patient, specific attention. The attention of people waiting for a meeting they had scheduled a long time ago. He sat down. He said, "How did you know I was coming?" Morag said, "We saw it. We see things in Ron Beeg, things that are coming, not always clearly, not always correctly, but we saw you, a man following a thread. We knew someone like you would come eventually. We put the thread there for someone like you to find." Marcus looked at her for a long time. He said, "The maritime anomaly." She said, "Yes." He said, "You manufactured it." She said, "We arranged it. Yes, we needed someone with specific skills, someone who would follow the data, someone who would come quietly and alone and wouldn't involve organizations." He said, "Why me specifically?" She said, "Because you're the best there is at finding things, and we have something that needs to be found." He stayed, not because they asked him to, they didn't ask him to, which was itself a kind of pressure. He stayed because 31 years of intelligence work had given him a finely calibrated sense of when a situation was dangerous and when it was something else, and this was something else. And because the thing they needed to find was, when Morag explained it that evening over tea and a meal of fish that had been caught that morning, exactly the kind of problem his brain was built for. Over 2 evenings and a full day, he slept in the community hall, on a cot that had been prepared for him, which he noticed without remarking on. The village told him what they knew. What they knew was this. Ron Beeg had been on this site since the 12th century. The current inhabitants were largely descendants of the people who had always been here. The village had a history of, Morag chose the word carefully, perception, not second sight in the popular supernatural sense, something more specific, a facility, strongest in certain family lines, for perceiving patterns in the world at ranges and scales that normal human perception did not reach, not visions, not prophecy, pattern recognition operating beyond the normal human threshold. She described it the way a scientist would describe a sensory capacity, as a function, not a mystery. Some people could hear frequencies others couldn't. Some people could perceive patterns in data that others needed computers to process. The people of Ron Beeg could, in certain conditions, perceive certain kinds of patterns in the world at scales that had no conventional explanation. They had used this capacity carefully for centuries. They had not advertised it. They had not sought attention. They had occasionally, when something mattered enough, used it to help quietly, without attribution. And for the past 7 years, what they were perceiving had been getting louder. Not clearer, louder, the way a signal grows in strength as its source approaches. Something was coming, something that had a pattern, complex, large-scale, operating across multiple domains simultaneously. They could perceive the shape of it without being able to read its content. It was like, Morag said, hearing a very large piece of music from very far away. You could hear that it was music, that it had structure, that it was organized and purposeful. But you couldn't hear the notes. You couldn't read what it was saying. They needed someone who could read what it was saying. They needed an analyst. He spent 3 days working with what they gave him. They gave him everything. They had 7 years of observations, recorded in the specific, careful language of people who had learned to document their perceptions without editorializing. Dates, times, directions, intensities, patterns they had noticed and patterns they hadn't been able to categorize. A village of 43 people, several of whom had this capacity at varying degrees of strength, had been running what was effectively a distributed observation network for 7 years, recording everything, waiting for someone who could analyze it. Marcus worked the way he always worked, systematically, without rushing toward conclusions, letting the data accumulate until the pattern resolved itself rather than forcing it. He had 3 days of access to the most unusual primary source material he had encountered in 31 years of analysis. The pattern, when it resolved, was not what he had expected. He realized afterward that he had expected something threatening, something that warranted the 6-month preparation, the manufactured maritime anomaly, the careful recruitment of a retired CIA analyst, something that intelligence frameworks were built to address. What the pattern showed was not a threat. It was a communication. Something operating at a scale and through mechanisms that his analysis could characterize but not explain, had been attempting, for at minimum 7 years and possibly much longer, to communicate with the people of Ron Beeg, not threatening them, not approaching them, communicating, sending a structured signal in a medium that only certain people could perceive and that nobody had yet been able to decode. He had decoded signals before. It was what he did. He worked the 7 years of observation data through every analytical framework. He had pattern analysis, frequency mapping, structural linguistics applied to non-linguistic data, the communication theory frameworks he had learned to apply to signals intelligence. He worked for 3 days with minimal sleep, which was normal for him in an active analytical phase. On the 3rd day, he found the structure. It was not a language, not in any conventional sense. It was closer to mathematics, a structured series of relational patterns that carried meaning not through symbols, but through proportional relationships, the way music carries emotion not through the notes themselves, but through the relationships between them. He spent 12 hours reading the relationships. What he read, what the signal was communicating, in the medium of pattern relationships perceived by the people of a 43-person village on the northwest coast of Scotland over 7 years, was a location. Not a message, not a warning, not a revelation. A location. Coordinates expressed in a relational mathematical system, precise to within what he estimated as a few meters. A point in the Atlantic Ocean, approximately 340 kilometers northwest of Ron Beeg, at a depth of approximately 2,800 meters. He showed the coordinates to Morag. She looked at them for a long time. She said, "We've been perceiving something at that location for longer than 7 years. Much longer, generations. Some of our older records suggest we could never resolve the location precisely. We knew it was out there." She said, "What is it?" He said, "I don't know. The signal gives the location. It doesn't describe what's there." She said, "It wants us to go and look." He said, "I think so." She said, "Will you help us?" He looked at her. He said, "I've been retired for 2 years. I followed a maritime anomaly to a fishing village in Sutherland. I decoded a 7-year signal produced by the collective perception of 43 people who can sense things the rest of us can't." He paused. "Yes," he said, "I'll help." He spent 4 months after the October visit building what the investigation required. He had contacts, 31 years of contacts, most of whom owed him things he had never collected. He had the analytical credibility to get certain conversations started that others couldn't. He had the specific knowledge of how to pursue something significant without attracting institutional attention. He engaged a deepwater survey company in Bergen through a chain of introductions that kept Ron Beeg's involvement invisible. He framed the commission as a private oceanographic interest, a legitimate use of the survey capability, not unusual among wealthy private clients. He provided the coordinates. The survey took place in February 2024, 2 weeks of deepwater multibeam sonar mapping and ROV deployment at the target coordinates. The survey results arrived in March. He drove back to Ron Beeg to deliver them in person. He spread the survey data on the community hall table. Morag and 8 other village residents stood around it. The multibeam sonar showed the seafloor at 2,800 meters, in detail sufficient to identify features to approximately 1 meter resolution. The target coordinates showed a structure, not geological, not a shipwreck, not any natural seafloor feature he had seen or read about in 31 years of working with imagery. A structure, regular, geometrically precise, partially buried in the deep-sea sediment, but with elements extending above the sediment surface in configurations that were recognizably architectural. Approximately 400 meters across at its widest point. The ROV imagery showed details that the sonar had suggested, but not confirmed. Materials that were not stone and not metal, and not any substance the survey company's analysts could identify from the spectral data. Surfaces that were, the survey company's report used the word intact, in a condition inconsistent with extended submersion. And at the center of the structure, the ROV had approached to within 20 meters before the survey company's protocols required it to withdraw from an uncharacterized site, something that the ROV's imaging systems had captured in 3 frames before the system had experienced what the survey company logged as an unexplained sensor dropout. 3 frames, clear, high resolution, lit by the ROV's external lighting at 2,800 meters depth in the North Atlantic, showing a surface covered in markings, structured, mathematical, relational. The same relational mathematical system he had spent 12 hours reading in the village community hall in October. He looked at the 3 frames for a long time. Then he looked up at Morag. He said, "It's been sending for a long time." She said, "Yes." He said, "It knows we received it." She said, "Yes, we think so." He said, "Asterisk, what do we do now?" Morag looked at the 3 frames on the table, the markings at 2,800 meters, the structure at the bottom of the Atlantic, the signal that the people of Ron Beag had been receiving for generations and that he had spent 3 days learning to read. She said, "We answer." He said, "Asterisk, how?" She said, "That's what we need you to work out." He looked at the data, he looked at the markings, he looked at the relational mathematics that he now understood incompletely, imperfectly, but enough how to read. He said, "I'm going to need more time." She said, "We've been waiting for generations. We can wait a little longer." In April 2024, Marcus was working in the community hall. He had effectively moved to Ron Beag, which was not a decision he remembered making, but which had happened gradually over the winter months, when he found something in the village's oldest records. Morag kept the historical documentation in a wooden chest in the community hall, generations of careful record keeping, the observations of people with the perception going back as far as written records in the village existed. He had been working through the oldest documents with translation help from a village resident who read the archaic Scots Gaelic of the earliest records. The oldest document was a single page, estimated by its physical condition at approximately 300 years old. A careful record, the same careful language as all the others, the same methodical documentation of perception. It recorded a perception event from what the translator estimated was approximately 1710. It described the signal from the Atlantic location, the same pattern 300 years ago. And at the bottom of the page, a note, added later in different ink in a slightly different hand, translated. The signal changed in the summer. It is no longer sending the location. It has known we know the location for many years. It is sending something else now. We cannot read it. We believe it is a name. We believe it is asking for someone by name. We cannot read the name. We hope that when the right person comes, they will be able to. Marcus looked at the note for a long time. Then he looked at the 3 frames from the ROV, the markings at 2,800 meters. He had spent months learning to read the relational mathematics of the signal. He had decoded the location. He had understood the structure of the communication. He had not looked carefully at the 3 frames since he had brought them to Ron Beag in March. He looked at them now. He read the markings at 2,800 meters with the framework he had spent months building. The markings were not the same as the signal, different content, the same system, different content. He read it slowly, carefully, the way he read everything. It was a name. His name. Not his CIA designation, not his cover name, not any professional identity he had ever used. His name, his full name, as his mother had given it to him, as it appeared on his birth certificate, as nobody outside his immediate family had ever used in 31 years of professional life. At 2,800 meters in the North Atlantic, in markings that, by the physical evidence of the survey data, had been there for considerably longer than 58 years. Considerably longer than 300 years. He sat in the Ron Beig Community Hall for a very long time. Then he picked up his pen.